July 4th has been recognized as the United States' national birthday since 1776, meaning, of course, that next year we will be celebrating our 250th. But not all Independence Day celebrations have been the same. One particular year, the New York Times proclaimed, America's glorious Fourth in this year of grace will more than likely be written in the future history of the entire world as one of the most portentous days that has ever dawned. It was an Independence Day that represented the hopes and the fears and the conflict of a difficult time in world history and for the nation whose birthday was being celebrated. July 4th, 1917, deserves to be remembered. The U.S. had finally entered the Great War on the side of the Entente on April 6, 1917, and the first 14,000 American troops had arrived in France on June 26th. Just 8 days later, Independence Day became a cause for celebration for the beleaguered Allied nations. Lord Balfour, a former prime minister, had been instrumental in establishing the new Anglo-American alliance with a mission after the U.S. declared war, offered a statement that suggested that the American entry into the war healed the wounds of the American Revolution. I do not grudge the glories of Washington and his soldiers. I have no tears for British defeat which ended in the triumphal establishment of the American Republic. My only regret is that memory should carry any trace of bitterness. Surely there is none on our side. In true perspective, the past should not interfere with the continuity of history, and the considerations binding us together, which century by century must bind us closer. He was not alone in his sentiment. The king ordered that the Stars and Stripes would fly over Parliament's Victoria Tower. The Times of London opined that the U.S. entry into the war was also an entry onto the world stage. They will have their reward not only in helping to save civilization from its present agony, but in an American ennobled by sacrifice, strengthened by a new consciousness of unity, made more efficient for all the purposes both of war and peace, and broadened by contact with worldwide interests and problems. The political balance of the universe shifted when General Pershing's troops landed in France and America, and entering the war has also entered the world. To play in it, we are very sure, side by side with the Allied democracies, a vigorous and inspiring part. But even more, the Times noted the weight of the day. There have been many memorable 4ths of July in the past 141 years, they wrote, but never one so pregnant with the drama of great events such as this. The British enthusiasm, however, was dwarfed by that of the French. The New York Times proclaimed, for the first time in history, American Independence Day was celebrated today as a national fete in another country by another people. July 4th, 1917 will stand out as the day on which Paris first welcomed American soldiers, not only as allies against Germany, but as defenders of that ideal of freedom which France also celebrates on July 14th. Both days are fetes of liberty, and everything today seems to point to that idea. The people of France had reason to celebrate. As the American Battle Monuments Commission explains, the war would soon enter in its 4th year with no end in sight. Every French family had been touched by the injury and loss of loved ones and the austerities of war. The arrival of the first units of American soldiers was a much anticipated and welcome symbol of relief to the war-weary French. And the French responded. The Associated Press wrote, the crowds removed the head coverings in salute to the Stars and Stripes as the colors passed along. From every window, women and girls waved handkerchiefs or flags, while everyone along the route sounded the acclaims of the French people. That enthusiasm even penetrated the discriminating French palate, with the AP reporting that in celebration of Independence Day, restaurants throughout Paris put dishes suggesting America on their bills of fare, such as chicken a la Wilson, Independence cake, Turbo Lafayette, American cream soup, and peaches Rochambeau. The AP reported that it was said at police headquarters by officials familiar with previous demonstrations that this was on a greater scale than any they had ever seen, estimating the crowd to have been at least 1 million. It was so crowded it almost stopped the parade. The Times continued, everywhere the enthusiasm was tremendous, and though the day was not a public holiday, the crowd around the Picpus Cemetery was so much denser than had been expected that the police barriers were swept away, and space so restricted that our soldiers were unable to enter the main gate in column. Those soldiers were the 2nd Battalion of the U.S. 16th Infantry Regiment. The Muskogee, Oklahoma Daily Phoenix reported, "Envy of all British comrades, a certain battalion of General Pershing's Sammies put extra finish shine on their guns and bayonets and added brushing to their uniforms today as they prepared for a friendly invasion of Paris. They are to be the center of the French capital's celebration of the glorious 4th." Dr. Harvey Cushing, serving in the Army Medical Corps, wrote in a letter that they were about a battalion, I should think, of not especially well set up or well drilled troops, newly enlisted men of the 16th Infantry. But to the French, they looked like saviors. The Times wrote, "They might be going up to the trenches. They look so fit and ready," said one French officer, whose bandaged arm and ribbons showed that he knew what he was talking about. The regimental history of the 16th writes, "Sailing from Hoboken, New Jersey, the 16th Infantry Regiment landed at St. Nazaire, France, near the end of June 1917, as one of the first regiments to arrive on French soil. Soon after the U.S. Army's arrival, the French expressed a desire to honor our Independence Day and suggested that some of our troops participate with theirs in an appropriate observance. The people of Paris had not yet seen any American troops, and the French authorities felt that the actual appearance of U.S. soldiers on the streets would have a good effect on French morale. Once assembled at Les Invalides, Napoleon's burial place and a site sacred to the French people, the battalion was given an official welcome. It was an event steeped in symbolism for the two nations. The Battle Monuments Commission explains, "Pershing, with soldiers from the 16th Infantry, began the day's events at Les Invalides. Upon arrival, members of the 16th Infantry marched into the central Cour d'honneur with a veteran French battalion. President Raymond Poincaré, Marshal Joffre, other dignitaries, and aged veterans attended the ceremony. Descendants of French officers of the American Revolution presented their banners to Pershing. The symbol of Franco-American friendship was not lost on Pershing. He noted that from this location Napoleon declared days of national mourning after the death of George Washington." In his memoir, Pershing noted the significance. "No other occasion that I can recall was more significant or more clearly indicated the depth of French sentiment and the affection for their old ally." And the symbolism would continue. The Times explained that the route of the march itself was symbolic, past the Place de la Concorde with its obelisk reminding us that freedom is more precious than the blood of kings, on to the Place de la Bastille, where French won their first great victory over despotism. And finally, perhaps the greatest symbol of cooperation between the United States and France, the 16th Regimental History writes, "After this ceremony, the 2nd Battalion then began a 5-mile march through the streets of the city to Picpus Cemetery, where Pershing and the other Americans in attendance would pay homage at the tomb of the Marquis de Lafayette, hero of the American Revolution, and declare, 'Lafayette, we are here.'" Those words were actually uttered by a member of Pershing's staff, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Egbert Stanton. After expressing regret that "I cannot speak to the good people of France in the beautiful language of their own fair country," he said, "The fact cannot be forgotten that your nation was our friend when America was struggling for existence, when a handful of brave and patriotic people were determined to uphold the rights their Creator gave them, that France, in the person of Lafayette, came to our aid in words and deed. It would be ingratitude not to remember this, and America defaults no obligations. America has joined forces with the Allied powers, and what we have of blood and treasure are yours. Therefore it is that with loving pride we drape the colors in tribute of respect to the citizen of your great republic. And here and now, in the presence of the illustrious dead, we pledge our hearts and our honor in carrying this war to a successful issue. Lafayette, we are here." Some, of course, would cynically complain that the Americans had taken too long to join the fight, and it was not lost on them. After being presented with a tattered Star-Spangled Banner that had been carried by Americans in the French Foreign Legion throughout the war, an officer told the Times, "The thing that touched us most of all was the little bit of Old Glory that had been flying on Europe's battlefield since the very beginning. It hurt our boys to think that we have come so late. We ought to have followed that flag from the start." Still, the overall feeling was of hope. Marshal Joseph Joffre, former commander-in-chief of the French army, said, "I am delighted that the people of Paris had a chance to see what the American army is like. Now they will share the knowledge that I brought back from America, that victory is certain, because men like this will replace the young men France has lost." While the optimism was real, the sentiment was actually sobering. These young men had not come to France for a parade. A sign of what they would face was casually mentioned in the Associated Press report on the day. Other hundreds of French soldiers in trench work uniform, stained and dingy, joined the marching troops on either side in columns and continued for miles. Some of them wore bandages on their heads, and others had their arms in slings from recent wounds. The Americans marched from Paris into training. In the coming year, they would experience the trenches. Their uniforms would become stained and dingy, and they would earn their own bandages. The parade was, of course, a march into war. To punctuate that, the same day the Kaiser's troops made an attack along a dozen miles of the French line as part of what would be called the Battle of the Observatories. Times correspondent Wythe Williams wrote, "It all happened last night, when 4th of July celebrations usually began, and their skyrockets and giant crackers would undoubtedly have impressed any small American boy who could have been there to see them. It beat any show ever seen on Manhattan Island, all hollow." The attack was beaten back, Williams noted. "It is well to remember on this American day of all days that it is that long line of poilus that still stands between the Germans and the civilization with which American soldiery has cast its lot." The war was weighing on another ally on that Independence Day. The February Revolution had overthrown Imperial Russia, establishing the provisional government. Russia's involvement in the war was in question. The Times reported that Independence Day was celebrated at the American Embassy. As the reception closed, a big street demonstration occurred in front of the embassy by soldiers and citizens representing the Military League, a patriotic organization favoring the continuation of the war. The newest participant in the Allied cause did their best to keep the old ally in the fight. The Times writes, "Ambassador Francis from the balcony replied to the felicitations and cheers from the street with a speech of some length, drawing a parallel between the early struggles of the forefathers on the American continent to win liberty with the present efforts of the Russian people." July 4th, celebrated by Russians and compared to the Russian Revolution, seems bizarre today, but it was also ironic in context. The provisional government had met its obligations to its allies and conducted a promised major offensive, the Kerensky Offensive, on July 1st. It would fail, and in its failure would come the October Revolution that would, among its many effects, remove Russia from the war, allowing the Central Powers to redeploy 50 divisions and engage in the deadly Spring Offensive, itself partly motivated by a desire to strike a blow before the Americans being celebrated on July 4th could shift the tide. The hope the Americans represented in the West could not save the war in the East. And it was in another celebration, with another beleaguered ally, that American Ambassador Thomas Nelson Page, in a speech on Capitolia Hill for a celebration of Independence Day organized by the Italo-American Committee, expressed the nature of the American cause to the people of Italy. One who has been reared from infancy on the history of ancient Rome may well be pardoned if he is moved in standing for the first time on this historic spot. This spot was once the center from which Rome spoke to the world. Today, her statesmen once more are sending forth a message of liberty to the world. This day was one dedicated to American independence. Today has even wider significance. It is dedicated to the independence of mankind. Is it only because America entered the war that this assembly is here today? I think not. She might have entered the war on the side of the Allies and yet have aroused more questioning than enthusiasm, had she entered it with selfish designs. It is the spirit in which she has entered it, the purpose for which she has drawn the sword in the cause of liberty, that has brought forth this meeting today. That cause is Italy's as well as America's, the cause of democracies of the world against autocracy. It was laid down in the President's appeal to America and through America to the world. It was emphasized in the letter your king sent him. In his message, the President of the Democracy of America spoke to the democracy of the world. In his message, King Victor Emmanuel of the Democracy of Italy responded in the same key. Democracy must win or perish. There is no other alternative. Democracy will win and will make the world safe for democracy. That message might have been lost to some on the other side of the Atlantic. As the Allies celebrated the American Independence Day, in America there were other speeches being given. Former President Theodore Roosevelt signaled the still fragile nature of the American entry with a speech on Long Island that the Associated Press described as a call for a single standard of patriotism and loyalty, attacking Americans who sympathized with Germany, saying that they were guilty of moral treason and are in fact, though not in law, moral traitors. Addressing what was a legitimate concern in the nation, Roosevelt said, "There can be no half and half attitude in this war, and no able man can afford to take such an attitude." But that was not the only division the nation faced. There was another speech in New York that day, and American troops were not just deployed overseas. 13 companies of the National Guard were patrolling the streets of East St. Louis, Illinois, as Americans grappled with the concept of democracy for which the nation was supposedly fighting abroad. Social, economic, and racial tensions had boiled over into violence July 1st to 3rd, with white Americans attacking black neighborhoods, burning homes, and killing an unknown number of black residents, maybe as many as 150. The National Guard was criticized for its inability to quell the violence, with some accounts saying that they had actively participated in it. It wasn't the only instance of racial violence in America at the same time that we were sending our young men overseas to fight for democracy. And so on July 4th, while speeches were given in London and Rome and Paris and Petrograd, a speech was given at Metropolitan Baptist Church on 138th Street between Lenox and 7th Avenues in New York by Hubert H. Harrison, president of the Liberty League of Negro Americans. To great applause, Harrison argued that Negroes who fear mob violence, whether in the South or elsewhere, should arm themselves with rifles and defend themselves. They are saying a great deal about democracy in Washington now, he said, but while they are talking about fighting for freedom and the Stars and Stripes, here at home the whites applied the torch to the black man's homes, and bullets, clubs, and stones to their bodies. We intend to fight, if fight we must, for the things dearest to us, for our hearths and homes. July 4th, 1917 was an Independence Day that represented perhaps desperate hope and clearly well-deserved fear. It spoke to high ideals, but a nation that was still struggling to live up to those ideals. It came to a world that was mired in conflict, in war and rebellion. It presented words of peace in a time of war and words of war in hope of achieving peace. It gave cause not just for this nation, but for the entire world to reflect upon the meaning of the rebellion that had begun in North America in 1776. And it heralded through parades and speeches a great challenge, the year to come, which for the world would be one of the deadliest, worst, most destructive years in human history. It was an Independence Day like no other. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.